Hello, this is the Bite Weasel, and in this video, we'll once again be continuing work on our Roblox Tycoon game. We're going to be investigating what we can do to improve the look and feel of our existing mechanics. So, in the last couple of episodes, we were basically focused on how to earn Robux. I gave you a couple of examples on how to sell a Game Pass and how to sell a developer product. In this tycoon, hopefully you can go away now, use those mechanisms, and add them into your own tycoon to create a bunch of developer products that hopefully fit with your theme and your tycoon. So, next, what I really want to do is focus on how to make our game look a little better. Right now, if we just play it, we do have a bunch of the basic mechanics. We have ability to stand on buttons that unlock things. We have that Game Pass and developer product buttons in the background. Um, but it's just kind of dull right now. There's no sort of polish. There's no feeling of like this is a well produced game. It's just sort of basic. So I kind of want to focus on adding some polish and sort of just cleaning up and improving mechanics that we already have. Before we go too far down that route, though, I do want to try and fix a couple of things that I've noticed in the latest version of Roblox Studio. Now, I haven't changed any of our code that we've sort of been creating over these last few episodes, but for some reason, now collisions no longer work properly. It used to be after you built one of these droppers, you could collide with it, and now we can't for no reason that I can see. And another problem that I've occasionally seen is that the upgraders don't work. You probably just saw that the product is supposed to hit this scanner and it then double in value, and it did there, but the previous ones don't. So sometimes collisions aren't working on this touch event either. So I kind of want to fix collisions, show you a couple of workarounds that I found to fix this, and sort of improve this part of the game in case you're hitting it either in your own tycoon or from following this tutorial and sort of updating Roblox Studio at some point. So for the first one, where you can no longer collide with built items, I have found a nice workaround for that one. If you recall, in our helpers script, we basically have these two functions. One's called show item and one's called hide item. And what happens is when the button gets created, it ends up hiding whatever it's linked to. And then when you buy the button, it shows that linked item. And so for collisions, this used to work by just having can collide set to false. And then when you show the item, resetting can collide to be whatever it was in the template, which for almost every single item is true. The only thing can collide is set to false on in our current template is the scanner part of the upgrader. So I don't know why collisions on the droppers no longer work properly. But here is a workaround. If you go over to your collision groups, if you remember, we've done this before, go to the model tab, collision groups. We actually have a couple of collision groups already. We have the factory, which is assigned to every single part of the template. And we do that right here in our factory code at the top. As we're going through the template and we're assigning various things, we also set the collision group to factory. The only thing that doesn't use collision group factory is the product that gets dropped, which uses product, and the player that joins, which is default. And if you recall, factory can collide with everything, but product cannot collide with the player. And that was to stop people running on the conveyor belt and sort of hitting the products off and missing the seller. So we can do a similar thing here by adding a new group and just calling it hidden. And this collision group, we want to collide with absolutely nothing, except maybe we want it still selectable in Roblox Studio. So we'll leave that one on. But now, if something is assigned the hidden collision group, it will not collide with anything. So we can use that in our helper function to, instead of setting can collide to be false, which I assume is what's causing the issue in the latest Roblox, we can instead set the collision group to be that hidden, which essentially does the same thing because even though can collide will be true, it won't be able to collide with anything because nothing in this group is allowed to collide. So that's pretty straightforward. And then when we show the item, we can literally just set it back to whatever the collision group was in the template, which for everything will be factory, but just in case we decide to change it later, this should reset it. So now if I once again play the game, you should notice that I cannot collide with a hidden dropper, but if I buy it by clicking on here, I can now collide with it. And I don't know why it works with collision groups, but doesn't work with can collide, true or false. But that is a fix if you're seeing that issue in your game. Next, I want to tackle this upgrader. So sometimes it works perfectly well, and the product hits the scanner, which is the yellow part, and a touch event triggers, and it doubles the worth of that value. But sometimes it does not, and we saw that earlier. And that, I guess, is to do with the reliability of touch events inside Roblox. But we can fix it with another workaround. And this workaround will actually make our upgraders much, much more reliable. So if I open our upgrader script, let's just take a look at how it currently works. So currently, what we do is when we create an upgrader, it gets on added because of the collection service, and then we hook up the touched event to the scanner. And when that triggers, we double the value of the product that's gone through. And this sometimes works, but because the player isn't really involved, unlike a button where the player has to physically stand on the button, so those touch events are more reliable, because this has no player involvement, sometimes those touch events can be missed. I guess it's something to do with performance, and Roblox just doesn't propagate things in the same way unless the player is nearby. So instead, what we can do is we can actually do something more reliable and use a function that will check to see if the product is touching the scanner every frame. We can do that using a thing called the run service. Now, you may recall we've used the run service before, but really just to call a method to check to see if the script is running inside Roblox Studio. Well, the run service also has another function on it, and that is called the heartbeat event. And this event fires every frame after the physics simulation has completed. And this you can use to create a much more reliable upgrader. And I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So we'll listen to this heartbeat event that's going to trigger once a frame, which is about 60 times a second, depending on your frame rate. And we can do some code in here. Now, the problem is running something that often, like every single frame, can cause your game to be slow. So anything you write in here, you want it to happen as quickly as possible to not block anything else in the game from happening. Okay. So we use heartbeat very rarely, but when we do need it, like in this situation, the code that we write in there needs to happen as fast as possible. Okay. And I'll show you how we're going to do that right now. The first thing that we're going to want to do, of course, is loop through our upgraders. So if you recall, upgraders are stored in this object called upgrader, which is actually incorrect. So let's just fix that. It's going to be a list of upgraders, plural. So they're stored in this upgrader as the key, and the value is actually the touch event. So we're going to loop through the keys, because that's what we want, in the pairs of our upgraders. And we're going to do something. And what are we going to do? Well, what we need to do is check really quickly to see if anything is touching our upgrade scanner. And Roblox has a function for this on the workspace, and that is called get parts in part. And this basically does a quick check of the volume of the two parts as it goes through all the different ones. And then if those two intersect, it adds it to the list that it gives you. So this is kind of quick. There are other ways that you can sort of check to see if two parts are touching, but this is one of the fastest. So this is what we'll use because we're in the heartbeat and want things to happen fast. So then we'll get the parts that are touching, essentially, the scanner. And that will give us a list of those parts that are touching it. And then For each one of those parts, where we want the key this time, in pairs of the parts. And what will we do? Well, we'll basically call our existing onTouch event, and we'll send in the upgrader that we're looking at and the part that was touching us. And that's it. How simple is that? That's just going to loop through every single upgrader we have, because if you remember, we only have a single script controlling all upgraders. Loop through all the upgraders, and for each one, check to see if there's a part touching the scanner. And if there is, we'll loop through all of those ones that are touching, which is probably just one at a time, and call our existing touch event. And that's going to work pretty good, but it's not as fast as it could be. So this get parts in part is pretty quick, but you can also pass in something else that tells Roblox, hey, you don't need to look through every part in the world to see if it touches. Instead, just the ones that I specify. And you can do that with this overlap params parameter. So we'll pass in an overlap parameter. And we'll call it OP, and we'll say overlap params.new. And then in here, you can set a bunch of things to specify which parts do you want it to look at. And the one that we're going to use is the collision group, because we know that the bits that we're interested in are only going to be in the product collision group. So this means when Roblox looks through the workspace to find all the parts that are touching the scanner, it can ignore, 99% of them, and it'll only look for things that have the product collision group, which is going to be like a couple of things in the world at a time. So this will work much, much faster. And in Heartbeat, that's really good because it's going to happen a lot. So we can also take this out and just sort of create it once instead of creating it every frame, and that will also improve our speed. But there you go. Now it's going to loop through every upgrader that we own, check to see if anything's touching the scanner, and if it is, fire the existing touch event. And that's great. That's going to work much more reliably than relying on the actual touch event. So what we could do is just delete this touch event because we don't really need it anymore, which means we don't need to disconnect it. Instead, we're going to rely on this heartbeat. And if I show you that now, you should see that it works every time. But the other thing that you're going to see is it works every time. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. So every single frame is basically going to check to see if a product is touching it. And every frame, product is touching it. And it's sort of doubling the value a lot. And we can fix that, obviously. So what's happening is there are a bunch of different frames where this product is sort of touching it. And so that get part in parts is returning the same product over and over. And we have no way of saying, okay, just do it once. But that's a pretty easy thing to change. So inside our upgrader, we can basically add a tag to the product after it's been upgraded and say, if that tag already exists, do not upgrade again, right? So the same way that we add an attribute as a value, we can also add a tag. And we can just say something like upgraded, right? And then up here, we can say if it's already upgraded. So if it has the tag upgraded, then return early. And that should be like a single check now. So if we play again, what should happen is even though it's going to be set to true in 10 of those frames, we should only actually upgrade the value of the product a single time because it will get set that tag and then next time it quits early because it already has that tag. But is going to have one more issue that we should fix, and that will be if you have a second upgrader on this line. If you do, the second upgrader is going to look and say, oh, that already has the upgraded tag on it, so I don't do anything. We don't want that. If we have multiple upgraders, we want it to still work. So what we can do is change this tag. Instead of saying upgraded, we'll say a tag unique to this upgrader. So one upgrader can add its own tag and look, and another upgrader can add its own tag to look and check. Okay? And we already have a sort of a unique thing that we can look up, and we'll get that as our upgraded tag. And so what is that? Well, our upgrader has an attribute on it called template ID, which we create when we sort of do the cloning of the factory up here. And that's going to be unique for each upgrader and the other items in the factory. So we can sort of use that as the tag to say, hey, this upgrader has upgraded it. And if you want to know that the tag has something to do with upgrading, we can sort of combine that here. Upgraded by, and then so it'll be like upgraded by 1 when you have one upgrader, and it'll be upgraded by 7, if the second upgrader is given a unique ID of 7. And so that will work. And it will work not only more accurately, because we're checking every frame instead of an unreliable touch event, but also it will continue to work if you have multiple upgraders on your line. And hopefully you do have multiple upgraders on your line, because your game is way more interesting than this one. So there we go. A couple of quick fixes to do with collisions that I just wanted to get out of the way. And now I want to sort of take a look at improving the overall polish of this game. The first thing that I want to focus on is these buttons, because right now they're kind of annoying to me. So these buttons are typical buttons. We use a touch event, and as soon as you touch on it, it builds the item or whatever. But that is kind of annoying to me. Like, even if you accidentally tinily touch it with just your pinky toe, it still builds it instantly. So sometimes you can imagine wasting money because you're trying to cut the corner to go over there in your Tycoon, and you accidentally hit the upgrader button with your pinky toe. And that spent a bunch of your money and you didn't mean to. So really, and the same thing sort of happens here. As soon as I stand on it, it happens. But also, even if you stay standing on it, when you move, that triggers another touch event. And that is sort of annoying, because even though I've left it, it's sort of triggered the touch event anyway. And it just feels bad. And I don't want players to feel bad when they play the game. I want them to feel good. So let's fix these buttons. And if we take a look at our button script, right now it's really simple. The way that it works is you just have a touched event on the face, and if it touches it, we buy the item, which ends up destroying the button. And that's it. What I want to do is have a little bit of a timeout. And we tried to do that before in our Robux buttons. In this one, we have a slightly different mechanism. We have the same touch event, but we have this debounce flag, where if the flag is already pressed, then we return early. Otherwise, we wait 3 seconds before we set it. And that's fine. You can not hit the button over and over again, but it still happens immediately. Like, it will still buy as soon as you first touch it. And if you wait more than 3 seconds while stood on that button, it will touch it again as you try and get off, which isn't ideal. Instead, what I kind of want to do is move this wait, maybe not for 3 seconds, but move that wait before something happens. And then if they leave the button before that timeout has expired, cancel everything. Don't buy something. So that would mean you could walk over the button pretty quickly and it wouldn't buy anything. But if you go back and stand on the button for, let's say, half a second, then it triggers. And that will just feel better, right? And we can also make the triggering look a bit better and stuff like that. And so let's focus on how to do that. And the way that I would do that is we need to track whether you're still on the button or not. And so there is a touched event, but there is also a touch-ended event that we could use. And I think it's going to be useful if we do this mechanism inside a shared place. Since we already have buttons and Robux buttons, and you can imagine maybe you make a toggle button or some other kind of thing, all of those buttons we're going to want to have the same behavior. So let's make it in a shared place. We already have a shared place. the helpers function. So let's add a new script thing in here somewhere. Let's just add it here. We'll call it module dot, I don't know, create button. And it will be a function that takes in a button, which is a model. And instead of having an item to buy, because that's not the piece we care about, it's going to have a face, which is a part. The face is the bit that we'll need to actually stand on and hook up our event to. So let's do that. Now, what does this really look like? Well, much like we did before, we need to hook up a touched event. Okay, so we're going to say button.face, which is the big green bit, dot touched, and we're going to connect up to that. And that will be a function that passes in the other part. Like you've seen all of this before. No surprises there. But we're also going to connect up to our touch ended event. And this fires after a other part has sort of left touching. So when you start touching something, you put your foot on the button, it's going to fire touched. And when you lift your foot back up, it's going to fire touch ended. This is going to be useful for us. So other part, because it looks exactly the same, which is a base part. And then that's that. So now we have two functions. One's going to be hooked up for touched, and one's going to be hooked up for touch ended. And we're going to need to know if something is still touching the button. So let us keep a list of the touching parts, right? We have a new table, and when something starts touching, we basically add it into there. And when something stops touching, we take it out. Other part equals nil. Pretty straightforward. When something starts touching, we put it in. When something stops touching, we take it out. But we don't want these buttons to work on anything other than the owner. So let's add a guard check in here. And we already have a similar sort of guard check inside our touched event handler for the original buttons. So we can just sort of copy this. In fact, let's copy both of them. Go back to helpers. And our guard checks now look like this. If there is not a button.parent because the button has been destroyed, or there is no other parent, it means some part of that is destroyed or it's not really a player, then we can check the owner. And if it is not the owner, return early. And this makes sense for both pieces, right? We only really want the button to interact with an owner. So we have the same guard checks there. So if it's not the owner, then just return. Now what do we want to do? Well, really when you stand on the button, the very first thing that stands on the button should start a timer, right? And if a second thing stands on the button afterwards, just ignore it because we've already started that original timer. And then if something gets off the button, we want to clear out that timer so it never ever triggers. Let me show you how we can do that. And it's going to get a bit confusing, but it shouldn't be too bad. Right? What we can do is we need to know if this thing that just started touching us is the very first thing. And how do we know that? Well, the length of this table will be 1. But because we're using it as a table of key and value pairs so that we can quickly look it up afterwards, and it is not an array, we have no quick way of getting the count. So instead, we have to loop through this thing. And we will say for each part called P in the pairs of our touching table, do something. And basically what we can say is if P, the part that we're looking at, is not equal to the thing that we just added into the table, then we can return early. Why is this? Well, if we're looking through this table and we find the thing we've just added, great. But if we find anything else, we know that this wasn't the first thing to touch the button. If it was the first thing to touch the button, it will be the only thing in that table. If anything else is in the table, we can return early. So let's just add a comment so we remember that. Make sure that only a single thing is touching the button, right? Or another way to put it would be make sure that this touch event is the first one, right? If anything else was touching the button, then it was going to return. Otherwise, we're going to wait for some time. Let's start the timer at 3 seconds, and we'll come back and sort of change this afterwards once we've got a good feeling of how long it should be. So now we'll start a timer for 3 seconds. And then after that timer has expired, what we want to know is something still touching the button? Because if they've walked off the button, we don't want anything to happen. But if they're still on the button, then we definitely want to do something. And how do we know if anything's on the button still? Well, we already have the for loop that checks if it's the first thing. We can use the exact same thing to check to see if anything else is in the button. The check, though, is going to be slightly different. Basically, if this for loop has anything in it at all, then we know we are good. Right? And what do we do when something is on the button? Well, we want to fire an event, much like the touched event happens. So the way that we can do this is sort of create a new event. We'll call it touch event, and we'll say is instance.new bindable event. We'll basically fire that when something touches it. We can basically say touch event fire, and you can pass in any parameters for a bindable event. And you sort of saw that before when we did a game pass check. So what do we want to fire? Well, we want to fire the button that actually triggered it, and we want to just fire, I guess, true to say that the button has been activated. So that should work nicely. Now, we want to do a similar thing in the end event. Basically, we set, when you leave the button, we set that part that was touching it to nil. And then we need to check, is anything still touching the button? Oops. So we'll copy this. So how do we know if anything is still touching the button? Well, we can loop through this. And then if anything at all is in this table, return early. It means something is still touching the button, so we don't need to do anything. Otherwise, if nothing is touching this button, we'll fire out the touch event again with this button, but we'll say false. The button has been cancelled. Okay? That is what our event is going to present. It's going to fire true, the button was activated, and false, the button was cancelled, so don't do anything. And then what we need to do is return out this touch event so someone else can listen to it. So how would it work? Well, we go to our buttons, and instead of doing this hook, where we hook the face's touch event, instead, what we can do is say helpers.create button, and the button is going to be this object, and the return value is going to be that touch event that we can connect to, and we could say on pressed. And we'll change our on touch event that we're not going to use anymore to be on to be on pressed. And that is going to take a button model and then just a, pressed value. And it's going to be true if the button was activated and false if it was cancelled. So now we don't need to check to see if the other part has anything because there is no other part. We don't really need to check for the owner because, we already have checked for it in the create button piece. But we do still need to get the owner. Maybe we should have just a mechanism that says, hey, get the owner. We can do that in here. We already have a check owner, but that actually checks that the other part was from it. So instead, we'll have something very, very similar, but we'll say get owner. And you send it in the factory thing, which isn't going to be a base model. It's going to be a model. It's going to be the factory button, right? that you send in. So factory item, the model, get the, this is what we want to do. Get the owner ID from the factory item's parent, which is the factory, and then get the player from the players service by going players get player by user ID, owner ID, and then we'll return that out. And if it's false, I mean, if it's nil, then obviously this will be nil. So you'll check it in the outer thing. So we'll say local owner equals get owner, and you'll just pass in the button now. And if there's no owner, then return. And before we bother getting the money, let's just check to see if the button was actually pressed. So if pressed, then return. Because really what we want to say is if it wasn't pressed, if it was cancelled, then don't do anything. Will this work? I think interestingly it might. And what I'm hoping to see now is when I stand on the button, nothing happens. Right? But if I wait on the button for 3 seconds, then it buys it. Oh, that feels much better, except 3 seconds is too long. Because now you can walk over this button and it doesn't activate. But if you stand on it, then it does activate. Nice. Let's change that wait value. Instead of 3 seconds, let's say 0.5, so you don't have to wait as much. And that's good, but there's going to be a bit of an issue. So it's clearer if this was 3 seconds. The problem is if you stand on the button, we start this timer. If you get off the button, we don't actually have a mechanism of canceling this timer. So if you get back on the button within that 3 seconds, eventually this one will trigger and it will say, you're still touching the button, let's fire it. But it was actually from a second invocation. You got off the button, so we should have cleared this timer, and then you get back on the button, it should be a new one. And so there isn't an easy way of doing this that I know of, except with a count. So let me show you what that looks like. What we can do up here is add a touch ID and set it to 0. And then before we start the timer, we'll basically say the current ID equals that touch ID. Right? And then after it, we'll say if the current ID is no longer equal to that touch ID, then return. And we will increment the touch ID whenever somebody gets off. Now, I know this is a bit confusing, but what's happening here is you stand on the button, and if it's the first thing, we store that touch ID, which is going to start with 0. So you can imagine this is 0. Then we start a timer. And then you leave the button before that timer is finished. And what happens is when you've left the button, the touch ID is now going to be 1. And so when this timer expires, we'll get here and we'll say, is current ID, which was the 0 we stored before the timer, equal to the touch ID that we just set to 1? No, 0 is not equal to 1, so we return. Right? And so it will skip that if you've left and got back on. But the act of getting back on will have re-triggered a new touch event that had nothing in the table. And so there'll be a second task that now has touch ID set to 1, right? And so when that one finishes, assuming you don't get off the button, the second one will trigger. So I think this is much better. Now you can sort of do that getting on, getting off, getting on, getting off, and it won't trigger until you've waited on the button for 3 seconds. So this should still work exactly the same as it did before. 1, 2, 3. Okay, my count is a bit slow, but now if I do this constantly, if I do this constantly on and off the button, it's not going to trigger, even though some of those things are hitting the 3 seconds while I'm still on the button. But now you have to wait for 3 seconds. That's good, but we can do even better. Now we have a mechanism for knowing if they stood on the button for long enough. We can actually do something when they stand on the button, but it fails to actually build anything. So this is where the polish comes in. So we've done that little bit, so now you can walk over the button without it actually doing anything accidentally. We'll change this down to half a second because 3 is way too long to wait. But now we'll add a bit of polish. And what we can do is we can sort of store the position of the face. And I'll show you what I'm going to do with that. So we can get the button dot face. Face. Oh, I've got to actually have a variable name. Position equals button dot face dot position. Okay. And then when they activate the button, what we'll do is we'll set the button dot face dot position equal to the position that we stored, so the original position, plus a new vector 3 that is a tiny bit lower than the current. So this will sort of move that face part of the button down when they press on it. And then when it's cancelled, so down here, we'll set it back to the position. And this is going to be more obvious when I use a button that doesn't disappear when you activate it. So right now, if I stand on the button, ooh, that's good. Look at that. You stand on it, it goes down. Boom. If you actually buy it, though, it destroys the button. But that feels good. And over here, it's going to work the same if we hook it up for these Robux buttons, which we haven't actually done yet, but we'll do in a minute. So when you buy the button, it looks like that. But when you can't buy it, ooh, it still feels like you're actually pressing something. Feels good. We can make it even better, though. We know if the button is cancelled, and we know if the button is activated. And if the button is activated, but we can't afford it, why don't we change the color? So what we can do is, if they can't afford it, we can set the button.face.brick color to be brick color red. So now if they can't afford it, that button will turn red, which is going to be nice. But we want it to turn back to green once they leave. So how do we know if they've left? Well, we know if they've left because we have this pressed event value here. So if not pressed, which means the button has popped back up, we can set it back to helpers.get template for the button face dot brick color. So set it back to whatever the template's color was. And I think that is going to look and feel really good. So now we can stand on this button, can't afford it, it turns red. And then we get off, it turns green and pops back up. Oh, that feels good. Right? And it's this little kind of polish that you can add to your game that just makes it look way more professional. So I know that there's a lot of code for very little effect, but it just feels much better now. So you can do that. We can then do the exact same technique, but in the Robux button. Okay? But there you won't need to turn red because you probably just buy it anyway. So the way that this works is there is a touch event, but we're going to do helpers.create button, send it in the button, which is the object, and connect up to the activated thing that we have and call it on pressed. I guess it could have been unactivated, but that's okay. The rest of this will then continue to work, except we don't need this debounce because it's built into that helper function now. So in fact, we can get rid of this. We can get rid of this and just turn it back into that, which means we get rid of .touch down here and we change untouched to be unpressed. This second parameter to be whether or not it was pressed or cancelled, which is a true or false value. We get rid of this, and it's the same cleanup we did in the other one. The owner is now get owner from the button instead of checking to see if the owner was what pressed it. And then this is just going to be the same as we had before. So if it's not pressed, then return. It means they cancelled out of it. We don't need this debounce anymore because it's built in. And then if it is pressed, we do this. We probably could change the color as well, like we did with the regular button, but I don't think it's necessary. Because it'll look a little weird if they cancel out of it and it turns red after it's already been activated. You could, but technically activating the button will always work because activation is prompting, not purchase. But it feels much clunkier now and chunky. Feels good. So there we go, a quick bit of polish for buttons. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, leave a comment, ring that notification bell, all that good stuff, and I will see you next time.